nodding your heads over here? All right, so this is, now first you have to realize that this is kind of an unusual thing to have printed in the 18th century, because most of the printing that happens in the 18th century is made with individual little letters that are just lined up to be able to spell the words out. But this is a different printing technology that allows us to print a picture. And so printed pictures are really pretty rare in the 18th century. And so this particular image was etched. You have to make a plate that will print this, and it was etched by a Boston silversmith who history has come to revere. Do you know who it is? History has come to revere him. Paul Revere! We have a student of history right here in the front row. And this, of course, depicts something that we call today the Boston Massacre, but which at the time, many of the Americans referred to it simply as the bloody massacre perpetrated in King Street. Now, the folks in England who talked about it most often referred to it as the unfortunate incident that happened in King Street. And so an interesting thing about this particular event in America or world history is that we have lots and lots of contemporary contemporary descriptions of what happened. Hundreds of depositions were taken of eyewitnesses that saw this, and yet we still really don't know all the details of what happened because the reports are so conflicting. But let me give you what I think is my best understanding of this. So first of all, you have to realize that the Boston Massacre, and this is what happened, is that we have British soldiers have fired and killed several of the American colonists. Now, it's not exactly like this is shown in the picture, as you'll see. But that's the event that we're talking about. It happened on March 5th, 1770. So tell me March 5th, what season is March 5th in?
Winter.
Ah, it's in winter, very good. So not just a student of history, but a student of meteorology and weather. It's interesting. So, but it's late winter, right? Because spring is just around the corner. Okay, so that's going to become important when we find out exactly what happens here. So March 5th is a Monday night, but the events that led up to these soldiers firing and killing these inhabitants of Boston actually started the Friday before. Now, to understand what's happening here is you have to first understand that at this point, there's almost 1 out of every 5 Bostonians is a British soldier. Why are there so many British soldiers in Boston right now?
They're trying to invade it.
They're not trying to invade it. They're here trying to convince us to pay our taxes. For 150 years before this is how it worked. When Parliament thought we should put a tax on the folks over there in America, they would make a new law that says, here's a tax. You've got to pay a tax on all the molasses that you import into the colonies. And we would say, that sounds very interesting, but we're just not going to pay it. And so Parliament would send folks over here to enforce the tax. And then they would find out that it cost more to enforce the tax than they were actually bringing in by enforcing the tax. And then they would give up on it, and we would just not pay the tax. That's the way it worked, okay? And it worked out all right, kind of for everyone, until the French and Indian War. Because in the French and Indian War, Great Britain spent so much money defending the colonies in America, they said, you really do need to start paying your taxes, and now we're sending soldiers. So what do you think? Do you think you like seeing all these soldiers around Boston? They're here to make us pay our taxes, and we think, wait a minute, this has worked great for 150 years. We don't pay taxes. They say, no, you're going to have to pay taxes. But not only that, not only are they here to make us pay taxes, but something else is happening. Now, to understand this, you have to realize, what are British soldiers allowed to do when they're not on duty? And the answer is, they can do anything as long as it's legal, including look for work. And that's what many of these soldiers do. Now, you think about these British soldiers, do they have to pay money to buy their food? Nope, the army provides their food. Do they have to pay money to have a place to sleep? No, they sleep in the barracks, and the army provides that. And so they don't have to spend a lot of money, so they are willing to work for lower wages than the rest of the folks in Boston. So not only are they here to make us pay more taxes, we're not earning as much money to be able to pay those taxes that they want us to pay. And so whenever we see a redcoat soldier, you might see one of them over there, we think all kinds of bad things about those redcoat soldiers. Now, this now happens on Fridays before the Monday of the Boston Massacre. Now, if you look over there, can you see the Boston Harbor? Do you see that water over there in the Boston Harbor? And just on this side of the water Oh, can I see it? Yeah, do you see that tarp going across? All right, that's what's called a rope walk. Over there, they are making rope. That's Gray's rope walk. And it was right over there that a group of soldiers from the 29th Regiment were walking along the pier. What were they up to? Were they looking for work? I'm not sure if they were out looking for work, but at that moment, when they're probably about as far from here to the rope walk as we are, Samuel Gray, there at the rope walk, calls out to them. He says, "Soldiers, will you work?" And the soldiers say, "Yeah, we'd be glad to work." And he says, "Well, why don't you go and clean my small house?" Now, to understand this insult, you have to understand what the small house is. What do you think is the smallest house on your property? I think you know it. It's the outhouse. He says, "Well, if you want something to do, go and clean my outhouse." Well, this is an insult, and these soldiers aren't going to take it very well. Now, these soldiers are not on duty. So do they have their muskets with them? They do not. They are unarmed. And so they kind of run over here to where those rope makers are working. "Why don't you say that again?" "Okay, go and clean my small house." Everyone laughs, and they get into a fist fight. And much to the surprise of the soldiers of the 29th Regiment, the rope makers of Gray's rope walk beat them up, and the British run away bloodied with their pride wounded. Well, they come back later that night with more soldiers from the 29th Regiment. And again, they get into a fist fight, a street brawl with these rope makers. But what those soldiers didn't know is that the ones that were working outside in the shade, they were just some of the rope makers. The rest of the rope makers were working inside, and more rope makers pour out, and they get into a fight again. And again, they beat up the soldiers of the 29th Regiment, and off they go. Now, their tempers are going to simmer over the weekend. And Monday night after work, we've got the people who are working at the Gray's rope walk. They're walking home. They happen to go past the customs house. Now, almost always standing in front of the customs house is a British sentry. Do you know what a sentry is?
No. Is it like a guard?
What's that?
Is it a guard?
It's a guard. That's exactly what it is. And maybe you've seen a long tradition of having to stand as a sentry in the British Army. You even see them still to this day in England. You'll see them standing there with their red coats, often have a bearskin cap on, a hat on, and they're just sitting perfectly still, just being guard. And have you seen people try to make them laugh and whatever, and they just sit there perfectly still? That's the same thing that was going on here. But now these rope makers who are walking home from Gray's rope walk, they recognize the soldier who's standing sentry. It's one of the ones that they fought with on the Friday before. And so what do you think? Are they just going to walk past without saying anything? No. And so they start to yell insults at this soldier. "Why don't you just go home, you bloody lobster?" Now, they don't like to be called lobsters, right? They're wearing their red coats, and it was an insult to them. Probably not quite as bad as asking them to clean your small house, but that's an insult. Now, this soldier is on duty. So what does he have standing at the side next to him? He's got his musket. Is that musket loaded and ready to fire? Yes. The answer is yes. Now, these rope makers know that that soldier is not allowed to fire his musket except under two conditions. Anyone want to say what one of those is? When is he allowed to fire?
If he's under attack.
If he's under attack, he can fire to save his own life. So if his life is immediately threatened, he can fire on his own authority. And what is the second reason he can fire?
Is it if somebody else comes on the property with the gun?
So that would be the first one. So so if his commanding officer, if he receives an order to fire, then he can fire. Now, do you think the colonists know that he's not allowed to fire except for those two conditions? The answer is yes, they know. And so they start yelling insults at him. What do you think? Is he allowed to fire? No, they know that he's not allowed to fire. And so they start to tell him, "Why don't you just take that musket and fire it? Come on, shoot it right here." They know he can't do it. And so they're taunting him. Now, as they're making all this noise, other people are going to hear. And listen, there's no television in the 1770s. This is going to be the most exciting thing that's happening that whole night. And so when people hear what's happening, they're going to come out and they're going to say, "Hey, what's going on out here?" And so a crowd begins to gather. By the time we have about 30 colonists gathered, what do you think? If there's 30 colonists and you're the one British soldier standing there, are you going to get nervous?
Yes.
Yeah, you have a question?
I think if everybody was out there, then the person would probably come out and realize it.
So you think the person would what?
He would probably come out and give him a command.
Ah, so what you're saying is, under that situation, maybe his commanding officer is going to come and help him. That's exactly what happens. And so this sentry will kind of pound on the door of the customs house, and then they'll say, we need some help here. And they pass word back to the barracks where Captain Preston is, his commanding officer, and they say, you've got a man in trouble. And so Captain Preston comes with 7 other soldiers. As they're coming, we now have more people gathering in front of the customs house. By the time Captain Preston arrives with the other soldiers, there will be about 90 other colonists gathered there. As Captain Preston is running here, there's all this commotion, and the colonist yells out to him, Captain Preston, are your muskets loaded? And he will answer, yes, with powder and ball, but we will not fire. Now, by the time he then gets there to the relief of his other soldier, we now have something else that's started to happen. And that is, some of the people there have started throwing snowballs at that soldier and the new soldiers that have arrived. Now, it's March 5th. What is the snow like in March? Icy. Yeah, it's really icy. This is not powdery snow. I want you to look right there on the edge of the building. Can you see what's hanging down in the picture right there?
Is that Butcher's Hall?
Yeah, so it's right above Butcher's Hall, the name of the building, but there are icicles. Okay, so that lets us know this is not a new fluffy snow. This is an old melting snow. And so this is probably, the snow on the ground is probably full of ice. Now, it's not just ice, because what do we pave our streets with in Boston? Do you know?
Salt.
We don't pave it with salt. We don't pave it with rocks. The main thing we pave our streets with in the 1770s is oyster shells. We eat so many oysters, and we love oysters, by the way. We eat so many oysters that we just use the leftover shells to pave the street. And so as the people are making snowballs, they're mostly ice, probably some rocks involved, and oyster shells. Now, what do you think? Would you like to, have you ever been hit with a snowball? Does it hurt much?
If it's hail, heck yeah.
Ah, so you're saying if it's really ice, yeah, it would, but a normal fluffy snowball, not such a big deal. But now it's ice and it's rocks and it's oyster shells. That's going to hurt. But is your life in danger if someone's throwing you a icy oyster shell snowball?
Yes.
Probably not. Might hurt, but your life's not in danger. So are these soldiers allowed to fire? No, not unless Captain Preston orders them to fire. Well, what happens next? We don't know exactly what happened, but something happened that caused one of those muskets to fire. Did the soldier intentionally pull the trigger? Was the flintlock struck by a snowball? Was in the jostling of the crowd, did that soldier drop his musket and hit the ground and it fired? What's the likelihood that a primed and loaded musket would fire, a flintlock musket would fire if dropped? About 50%. And so is that what happened? The answer is we don't know. But as soon as the first soldier fired, the rest of the soldiers fired, and 5 of the colonists were killed almost instantly. A couple more are mortally wounded and are going to die a little bit later. Now, in the commotion that happened there, those soldiers knew they were going to have to get out of there. Now, how long does it take for them to reload? By the way, how many bullets does their gun hold at a time? One. It's a single shot. How long does it take to reload?
Like 20 seconds.
Yeah, 15 to 20 seconds. How do you know so much? Stand up. Oh, no, stand up here. Tell me your name.
Kyle.
Kyle. All right. I want you guys make a little room for Kyle. Are you a pretty fast runner? Okay, I'm going to have you run that way. We're going to count to 15 so you can see what can happen in 15 seconds while it takes to reload. You guys are all good. Everyone's going to count with me. Are you ready? On your mark, get set, go. 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005, 1006, 1007, 1008, 1009, 1010. He's out of places to run. In 15 seconds, a lot can happen. And so, are these soldiers, there's 100 colonists there. Are these soldiers going to reload for another fight? No. During the commotion, they're going to get out of there. Now, many of the inhabitants of Boston think we're going to go get those soldiers and we're going to have a riot. Long tradition of rioting in Boston by this time. But what happens is then Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson comes out and he addresses the crowd and he promises that there will be a fair trial. And as a result of those assurances, there's no mob violence that night. Now, we're going to end up with with 2 trials. The first trial is going to be for Captain Preston. Now, why are we having a trial for Captain Preston?
Because his soldiers shot.
What's that?
Because his soldiers shot.
Well, his soldiers are the ones that shot. But the first question is, did he give the order to fire?
No.
Well, we don't know the answer to that until we have the trial. And we're going to find out. We're pretty sure we know the answer to that. Did anyone yell fire? Yeah, the colonists were yelling at the soldiers, fire! And well, they were pretty surprised when someone fired. And so the first trial we're going to have is for Captain Preston. Now, to have a fair trial, what do we have to have? We need to have an impartial judge, an impartial jury. It's going to be pretty tough to find an impartial jury because everyone in Boston, how do they feel about the Redcoat soldiers? They really don't like having them there. So it's going to be pretty tough. Now there's someone that you know who's going to step up and he's going to help this to be a fair trial. He was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence from Massachusetts. His name is John Adams. So John Adams is one of the few people in North America at all at this point trying to make his living at the law. At this point, most of the folks who work in the law, it's like a pastime for gentlemen. They'll spend some time learning the law and coming and arguing a court case. But John Adams is now a new breed of lawyer who's trying to make his living at the law. This is really interesting because he knows that by taking the case of these soldiers and defending them in court, he's doing something very unpopular. And he may very well end up losing all of his other business because he's going to defend these soldiers. But why does he want to defend the soldiers? Because he knows that in America we have to be a people of the law, not of mob violence, of the law. And that means they need a fair trial, so they have to have an attorney to represent them. Now, if Captain Preston is acquitted, there's going to be another trial. It's going to be, we have to know, did those soldiers fire on their own? Were they justified in firing? Now, it turns out, although almost everything is in dispute about what happened, one of the things that the jury has a pretty easy time deciding is that Captain Preston did not give the order to fire, because most of the witnesses are going to say, yeah, I saw where Captain Preston was standing. Now, in this picture by Paul Revere, you see Captain Preston over here to the side. And can you see what he's doing with his sword? Yeah, you see he's leaning forward and he's got his sword up there. What is he doing? Yeah, this is the signal to attack. Or it may be, get ready to fire and then to drop the sword to fire. But in any event, in the picture, he's given the command. But this is not really what happened, because the jury at least agreed that he's not where he is, that he's standing over here between the colonists and the soldiers. What do you think? If you were standing between the colonists and the soldiers, would you give the order to fire? No, you'd probably get out of the way before you did that. And the jury said, we're pretty sure we know where he was standing. And so he's acquitted. So now we're going to have a second trial. So the question is, were the soldiers who fired justified in firing? Who's going to represent these soldiers in court? John Adams, the same guy. Oh, well, it turns out he's going to get 6 of the 8 soldiers off. No charges at all. But 2 of them are going to be convicted. Not of murder. So murder is what they're accused of. And what's going to be the penalty in Boston for murder in the 1770s? It's the death penalty. Yeah. So they're not accused. Good news, you're not convicted of murder. Instead, you're convicted of a lesser crime called manslaughter. What's the difference between murder and manslaughter? Murder is you meant to do it. Like you meant to do that action that killed that person, where manslaughter is you weren't really trying to kill that person, but you should have known better than to do that. And so that's still a pretty serious crime. So what's the penalty for manslaughter in Boston in the 1770s? It's also death. It's the same penalty. So good news is you're not convicted of murder. Bad news is you got the same penalty anyway. But the difference between manslaughter and murder is that manslaughter is administered with what's called the benefit of clergy. Now, to understand this, you have to realize, roll the clock back a few more hundred years earlier, and if you were a clergyman, someone who was a preacher and worked for the church, if you did something against the civil law, you weren't held accountable for that. You were held accountable to the church. So there would be a church court that would decide your guilt or innocence. And so if you were convicted, if you were a clergyman convicted of a crime, you would say, oh, hold on a second, I'm a clergyman. And they would say, oh, yeah, well, then we don't have any, we can't say anything about you because you're not subject to the laws of the civil authority. Now, by the 18th century here in the 1700s, We now have a thing that happens where the people in England and the rest of Great Britain are pretty uncomfortable with sentencing someone to death. And so they have this idea, it's a legal fiction called the benefit of clergy, which means if you're convicted of a crime that you would be killed for, and you can prove that you're a clergyman, then you're going to get off. Not just that they're going to, instead of killing you, put you for life in prison. No, you get off altogether. Well, what did you have to do to be a clergyman? Number one, you had to be a man. Number two, you had to be white. And number three, you had to be able to read the Bible. If you had those three things, you could prove that you were a clergyman, and then your sentence would be commuted. So, well, these two convicted soldiers, Privates Montgomery and Kilroy, they're both men, they're both white. The only question is, can they read the Bible? And here's the thing. It turns out, to find out if you can read the Bible, we're not going to just pick a verse at random. You're going to know the verse that it's going to be. What's the verse? Psalms chapter 49, verse 1. To this day, it's known as the neck verse. I think some of you probably have some kind of a connection to a worldwide network of information. If you were just to search for the neck verse, it would take you right to this verse. In that verse, we have King David imploring forgiveness from his sins. That's what this verse is. Now, what do you think? If you were sitting in jail, getting ready to be tried for a crime that could put you to death, do you think you'd spend some time trying to figure out how to read that verse?
Yes.
Yeah, probably so. But guess what? Even if you couldn't read it, you probably would instead just memorize it. Yeah, and probably because you don't even read Latin, because you're going to have to read it in Latin. So after they're convicted, Private Montgomery and Private Kilroy say, wait a minute, we're clergymen. And you're clergymen? We had no idea. Here, prove it. And they slid a copy of the Bible over to Private Montgomery, who looked at that verse. Can you read this verse? And he said he read it perfectly. He was so good at it, he even read it upside down. And they gave it over to Private Kilroy. He did the same thing. Oh my gosh, they're clergymen. And so their sentence was commuted, not going to be put to death. Instead, they would be branded on the thumb, the meaty part of their thumb right now, branded with an M. That's going to be painful, but it's a lot better than death. Why M? What does the M stand for? Manslaughter. Why do we brand you for that? And the answer is, you only get to invoke the benefit of clergy once in your life. And so if you try to invoke the benefit of clergy again, and we see that you've got a brand, then it's not enough just to know you've been branded. Sorry, it is. We have to go and find the court proceeding where you invoked the benefit of clergy, and if so, you can't invoke it again. So how many of you think it's a little fair that you have to be white and male to be able to invoke the benefit of clergy? That doesn't sound very fair. So, in fact, that was the same thing in England. And so when Queen Mary was the queen, she said, I don't think it's fair that women can't invoke the benefit of clergy. And so even though they can't invoke the benefit of clergy by that language, Queen Mary convinced Parliament to pass another law that extends the same benefits of the benefit of clergy to women. And so a woman who was convicted of a crime would be able to get off once by claiming that she deserved to get off, according to that law in Parliament. But we even have court records from Williamsburg, Virginia, where a slave was convicted of a capital crime. It was actually convicted of stealing, which would be the death penalty in Virginia. What did the slave say? Wait a minute, I'm a clergyman. You are a clergyman? Prove it. Can you read this verse? He read the verse perfectly, and he gets off. Come to find out, he's convicted of the same crime years later, and this time they notice the brand on his thumb, and they go and find the court proceeding. You only get to invoke the benefit of clergy once, and he will be executed. So this idea, the benefit of clergy, is something that is applied really quite equally across genders and all strata of society. But that then is kind of the story of the Boston Massacre. The thing that we learn about the importance of how we believed at the founding of America is that we felt very strongly about justice. Even though these British soldiers were hated and many people felt like we should just kill them all, it was important that we treated them justly